Part 31. Fortunate Young Gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 302. Xiaoju stared at Tang Ning with wide eyes and asked, "Have you known about Han Ming for a long time?" The Minister of the Ministry of Revenue is not a small fry among the 6 ministries, only the Ministry of Personnel has the same power as the Ministry of Revenue. The arrest of the Minister of the Ministry of Revenue is a big deal for the entire court. I don't know. Tang Ning shook his head. He didn't want to take the blame on himself, so he naturally wouldn't admit it. Xiaoju said helplessly, "Then why don't you send a gift?" Tang Ning said helplessly, "I asked for leave. I was planning to go to the Ministry of Revenue to ask in a few days, but now it seems unnecessary. At this time, you still have to send gifts to Han Ming, unless King Kong is stupid." I don't know what King Kong was thinking when he heard the news. Han Ming embezzled millions of taels of silver from the national treasury. Others avoided him, but he insisted on sticking to him. Ching jumped in from outside and said, "Son-in-law, there is a man named Kong looking for you outside." Tang Ning asked in confusion, "The man named Kong?" Ching thought for a while and said, "He said his name is King Kong something." Tang Ning was a little surprised that King Kong was so impatient and came in person. After thinking about it carefully, he felt it was normal. No matter how proud King Kong was recently, once he was related to this case, even if he was a prince, he would be skinned alive. If Emperor Chen was determined to punish him severely, stripped his prince title, and drove him out of the capital, the court officials would not have any objections. As for the powerful officials behind King Kong, their fate would be even worse. When he went out to greet him, King Kong was pacing in the front hall, his face full of anxiety. When he saw Tang Ning coming in, he hurriedly asked, "Have you sent the valuable gift that I ordered you to give to Han Ming?" "Not yet." Tang Ning shook his head and said, "I have been feeling unwell recently, so I took a leave at home and haven't had time to send it yet." "That's good, that's good." King Kong breathed a sigh of relief, and the big stone in his heart finally fell to the ground, and he collapsed on the chair. "I am really sorry for delaying your Highness's business." Tang Ning looked at him apologetically and said, "If your Highness is in a hurry, I will send it immediately." "Don't." King Kong jumped up from the chair and said, "No need to send it, no need to send it." He had finally escaped a disaster. If he sent this gift, even he couldn't imagine what kind of consequences he would have to bear. After heaving a sigh of relief, he looked at Tang Ning with a smile on his face and said, "Sir Tang, you are really my lucky star." "Your Highness, you are too kind." Tang Ning said politely, thought for a while, and continued, "Since this gift doesn't need to be given, Your Highness, take it back." King Kong waved his hand and said, "No need, Sir Tang is not feeling well. These gifts are my condolences. Sir Tang must get well soon." Tang Ning said in embarrassment, "Such a valuable gift, it's not good." King Kong waved his hand and said, "Hey, I can't take back what I have given away, Sir Tang, don't refuse." Although he felt sorry for the money, he also knew that if it weren't for Tang Ning's illness, he would have been taken away by the Zhongzheng Temple. If he entered the Zhongzheng Temple, even if he was a prince, he would have suffered a lot. It was hard to refuse the kindness of the King Kong. Tang Ning could only nod and say, "Then thank you, Your Highness." "You're welcome." The King Kong stood up, waved his hand, and said, "Master Tang, take care of your injuries. I'm leaving." "Goodbye, Your Highness." The King Kong was a very particular person, and he was very considerate in his etiquette. Tang Ning felt at ease accepting this gift. After all, even the King Kong himself didn't know how much of a blow it would be to the Prince Duan if Minister Han fell. He definitely didn't lose out by giving a generous gift to a minister of the Ministry of Revenue. Many of the things that the King Kong sent were things that Tang Ning didn't need himself. He walked into the inner house, waved his hand, and said, "King Kai calligraphy and painting, Xiaoshi, Zhu'er and Qing'er, don't stand there like an idiot, Come over and pick out gifts for you. The palace. The interrogation of Han Ming, the assistant minister of the Ministry of Revenue, was jointly led by the Minister of Punishment, the Minister of Dali Temple, and the Imperial Censor. No punishment was used during the interrogation. Han Ming confessed to embezzling tax silver. The case progressed very smoothly. The interrogation was over in less than half an hour. An eunuch stepped forward and whispered to the Imperial Censor. The Imperial Censor nodded and said, "Your Majesty has ordered that the criminal Han Ming be taken to Chongming Hall." He glanced at Han Ming, who was wearing a white prison uniform and had disheveled hair, with a complicated look and a long sigh. The Minister of Punishment looked at him, shook his head, and said, "How could Han Yushi, who was once fearless and unyielding, fall into such a situation?" The Minister of Punishment also sighed and said regretfully, "I still don't believe that Han Ming would commit corruption. It's a pity for a good minister of a generation, a pity." In the imperial study, Emperor Chen stood in the middle of the hall with a somewhat dejected look. Ling Yun stood a few steps away and bowed, saying, "Your Majesty, I have led people to take all 6 Han family servants, except Han Ming, the right assistant minister of the Ministry of Revenue, to the Ministry of Justice. And according to your Majesty's order, Han Ming has been taken to Chongming Palace." Emperor Chen looked at him and asked, "Han Ming is the assistant minister of the Ministry of Revenue, so there are only 6 people in his family?" Ling Yun nodded and said, "Han Ming has a wife, a daughter, an old servant, a cook, and 2 servants, only 6 people." Emperor Chen looked at him and asked, "Did you find the stolen silver in the Han family?" Ling Yun said, "Going back to your Majesty, we found a total of 63 taels of silver in the Han family. Except for a jade belt given by your Majesty in the early years, there is nothing else." Emperor Chen frowned and asked, "During the Han Ming dynasty, more than 2.3 million taels of tax and silver were embezzled. The annual salary, converted into silver taels, amounted to hundreds of taels. Why did the family only have so little money? How many taels of silver did it have? Where have the millions of taels gone?" Ling Yun bowed and said, "Wei Chen has searched through the entire Han family, but has not found the place where the silver is hidden. Han Ming lives with the poor people in the North District. According to his neighbors, the Han family lives a simple life on weekdays. He often takes out money to give rice and porridge to beggars." Emperor Chen was silent for a moment and said in a deep voice, "Go to Chongming Hall." In the Chongming Hall, Han Ming was kneeling on the ground. When he heard footsteps coming from behind him, he raised his head, knocked his head heavily on the ground, and said, "Han Ming, the sinner, please bow to your Majesty." Chen Huang stood in front of him, looked at him, and asked slowly, "Do you still remember how you became the Minister of Household Affairs?" Han Ming lowered his head, blood dripping from his forehead, but remained silent. "You don't remember, I remember." Emperor Chen looked at him and said calmly, 11 years ago, you were just a supervisory censor. At that time, the treacherous Prime Minister Cai Changquan swayed the government and the public, deceived the heavens, and committed many evil deeds that made people angry. Hundreds of officials in the court took photos because of the majesty of his power. You dare not speak out in anger. Only you, Han Ming, are not afraid of power, do not care about life and death, speak out and remonstrate, list 28 crimes against Cai Chang, bang your head against the wall in the Golden Palace, and remonstrate with death. 6 assassinations in the street, and you don't frown. The only legitimate son of the Han family died under the revenge of Cai thief, and you didn't back down. They tied up your old mother and forced you to submit. Your mother decided to die and not to be a burden to you. You single-handedly brought down the traitorous clan. I will promote you to the position of Minister of Household Affairs. I hope you can serve the country." Emperor Chen looked at him with a look of pain on his face and said in a deep voice, "Han Iking, my Han Iking, tell me what you have done these years." "I'm sorry for your Majesty, I'm sorry for the court. Han Ming's voice was hoarse, and he leaned over again and knocked his head hard on the ground. 1 time. 2 times. 3 times. His forehead was already bloody, but he still kept knocking. 11 years ago, I owed you 2 lives to the Han family. Emperor Chen breathed a sigh of relief, looked at him and said, today, I owe you 6 lives. Emperor Chen looked at him and said slowly, but I must also give an explanation to the people and the court. Han Ming fell to the ground and said loudly, thank you, Your Majesty. A eunuch stepped forward, took out a wine glass from the jade plate, and handed it to Han Ming. Han Ming took it with both hands, glanced at Emperor Chen one last time, and said with a smile, if there is an afterlife, Han Ming is still willing to be His Majesty's minister. He put down his wine glass, knelt straight, and bowed respectfully to Huang Chen. However, this time, after he lowered his head, he never got up again. After a while, the Minister of Punishment looked at a piece of white cloth in the Chongming Hall, raised his head and said, Your Majesty, Minister Han died like this. The person behind him. Chen Huang waved his hand and said, since Han Ming has pleaded guilty, the case is over. All officials involved will be severely punished. The Minister of Punishment bowed and said, I obey the decree. After the Minister of Punishment exited the main hall, Emperor Chen took a deep breath and said, King Xianduan enters the palace. Fortunate young gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 303. Palace Entrance. King Duan, who had just been urgently summoned to the palace, stopped, thought for a moment, looked at a eunuch and asked, Do you know why Your Majesty summoned me to the palace? The eunuch shook his head and said, Back to Your Highness, Your Majesty didn't say anything. King Duan stopped in place for a moment, and finally took steps again. He had just heard the news that Han Ming, the Minister of Household Affairs, had been arrested. He was in a panic, scratching his heart with 100 claws, and thinking about how to rescue him with the counselors in the palace, when he was summoned to the palace. Han Ming is the most important secret chess piece in his hand and his source of wealth. If something happens to Han Ming, it will be a huge blow to him. He still didn't know the reason why Han Ming was arrested, but until the last moment, he was unwilling to give up a money spinner that could influence the situation in the Ministry of Finance. Fortunately, few people in the capital knew about his relationship with Han Ming. At this moment, he wanted to find out the news from his father before making any plans. The eunuch led him to a certain place and said, Your Majesty is at Chongming Hall. You can go in. King Duan was a little surprised that the place where his father summoned him was not in the imperial study room. Chongming Hall was the place where his father usually meditated, and officials were rarely summoned here. He pushed the door open and entered. Chen Huang stood in the hall, with his back to him, and said slowly, Close the door. Prince Duan closed the door with some anxiety, took 2 steps forward, and asked, I wonder what my father has ordered when he summons his ministers. Chen Huang looked at him and said expressionlessly, Kneel down. Prince Duan was startled and opened his mouth, Father. Chen Huang said coldly, Kneel down. King Duan did not dare to ask any more questions and knelt down. Emperor Chen pointed to a piece of white cloth in the palace and asked, Do you know what this is? Prince Duan looked over and said blankly, I don't know. Emperor Chen said coldly, This is Han Ming, the right minister of the Ministry of Revenue. King Duan was startled for a moment, then his face turned pale, his body trembled slightly, and he forced himself to regain his composure. Emperor Chen looked at him and asked, As the right minister of the Ministry of Revenue, Han Ming has embezzled millions of taels of tax money from the country in the past few years. What do you think of this matter? My son, my son. Prince Duan had a trickle of sweat on his forehead and whispered, My son, I think that Han Ming deserves it for committing such a heinous crime and deserves his death. Boom. Chen Huang kicked Duan Wang on the street with such force that he moved several feet horizontally on the ground. Is he worthy of death? Bloodshot eyes appeared in Chen Huang's eyes, and he lowered his voice. You think I don't know that you have already won over Han Ming? You think I don't know that all the money he embezzled ended up in your pocket? Do you think I don't know? I don't know who is the culprit in this case. Chen Huang gasped and said a few words, which caused King Duan's complexion to change drastically. He knelt on the ground and said loudly, "Father, the emperor clearly knows that this case has nothing to do with my son. This case has nothing to do with my son." Emperor Chen took a deep breath and said, "What a good minister Han Ming is. Where is the treasury? You turned a good minister into a traitor. How dare you reach out to the treasury? You are so brave." Prince Duan's face suddenly turned pale and bloodless, and he panicked, "Father, father, I am not a son, this is not a son." Emperor Chen turned to look at Wei Jian and said, "Bring the torture stick." Han Ming, the Minister of Household Affairs, embezzled a huge amount of silver from the national treasury and committed suicide out of fear of crime. As soon as the news about this case came out, it was like a huge stone, causing the already uneasy lake in the capital to once again set off huge waves. This was the largest corruption case in the country in recent years, shocking both the government and the public. In just one day, word spread throughout the capital. Han Ming committed suicide out of fear of crime, but the case was not over. After a thorough investigation by the court, all the accomplices involved in the case were traced. A head of the household department, 2 doctors, and local officials from 3 prefectures in Bazhu were all arrested. Dare to reach out to the treasury, their results are not much better than Han Ming, but what surprised countless people is that after Han Ming committed suicide in fear of crime, King Duan was inexplicably banned by His Majesty for 3 months. According to rumors, King Duan was detained by His Majesty. He was beaten until he was unconscious in the Chongming Palace and was carried out by the eunuchs that day. The grapevine also said that the reason why Han Ming, the Minister of Accounts, was found guilty of corruption was precisely because Tang Ning, who was the head of the accounts department at the time, came up with an accounting method when checking the accounts of the accounts department, which could easily identify whether the accounts were corrupt or not. Fang Jie, the left minister of the household department, used this method to find out the fact that Han Ming, the right minister, had embezzled taxes and money. This was the reason for this major case that shocked the capital. Tang Ning had only been in the Ministry of Household Affairs for a month, but he personally brought down the right assistant minister of the Ministry of Household Affairs, which made all the officials in the capital panic. This was another highlight on his resume. Although everyone in the capital applauded Han Ming's arrest, Tang Ning, who edited the Hanlin Academy and was also the head of the household department, also gained the title of a broom star. The officialdom is complex. Among the many officials in the DPRK, who dares to say that his buttocks are clean, and who can withstand strict investigation? Tang Ning, who is now the head of the household department, will become the head of the punishment department and the personnel department in a few months. By then, it will be unclear whether the unlucky one will be the Minister of Punishment or the Minister of Personnel. Trouble marker. Tang Ning sat comfortably in the yard while Xiao Xiao brought grapes transported by water from the south to his mouth. Hearing the news, he opened his eyes and looked dissatisfied. Han Ming deserved what happened to the Minister of Household Affairs. Why did he say that he was the broom star? Even without him, Fang Jie would not have kept Han Ming in the Ministry of Finance. He had only done a small job in it. Xiao Ju came in from outside and ate a grape. Tang Ning saw him in armor and asked, "Why are you dressed like this?" Xiao Ju swallowed the grape with the skin and said, "Your Majesty's order to send Han Ming's wife, daughter, and family out of the capital." The punishment result of this case was actually somewhat beyond Tang Ning's expectations. The crime committed by Han Ming was a serious crime of the Yi tribe, but after he committed suicide out of fear of crime, Emperor Chen pardoned his family, which was already considered a mercy outside the law. I never thought that Han Ming would embezzle tax silver, Xiao Ju said with a look of regret. When I was a child, my father often told me about Han Ming's deeds. He was impartial, fearless of power, fearless of life and death, and was the first censor of the dynasty. He defeated the treacherous prime minister group with his own strength. He was the backbone of the court, but who could have thought that the backbone of the court would also bend? People will change, and various reasons will lead to such changes. The sea will turn into mulberry fields. Even Xiao Ju can become a real man, and a good minister may naturally become a treacherous minister. Thinking of the minister Han who ate steamed buns and pickles, Tang Ning still lamented in his heart. When Han Ming was confiscated, only more than 60 taels of silver were found in his house. It was sad and lamentable that a clean official fell to this point for Prince Duan. Tang family. Tang Qi and Tang Jing were still talking about the suicide of Han Ming, the minister of the Ministry of Revenue, for fear of crime. Even Tang Jing was shocked enough by this matter. However, in a study room in the Tang mansion, the atmosphere was extremely depressing. Your Majesty is really angry this time. Prince Duan needs to rest for at least several months before he can fully recover, Tang Qi said in a low voice. I'm afraid that this matter has not been concealed from your Majesty. It doesn't matter if you lose Han Ming. I'm afraid that after this incident, your Majesty will be completely disappointed with Prince Duan. Tang Hui was silent for a long time before he said, if this continues, Prince Kong will completely suppress Prince Duan. Tang Qi raised his eyebrows and asked, in this way, won't all our years of planning be in vain? Your Majesty is in his prime, and we still have a long time. Tang Hui sat on the chair and said slowly, Prince Duan will make mistakes, and Prince Kong will also make mistakes. Prince Kong can suppress Prince Duan now, but it doesn't mean that he can suppress Prince Duan forever. Tang Qi thought for a while and asked, brother, what do you mean, what should we do? The more you do, the more mistakes you make, and the less you do, the better. Tang Hui narrowed his eyes and said, we do nothing and wait for them to make mistakes. What if they don't make mistakes? Then create opportunities for them to make mistakes. You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Fortunate Young Gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 304. The case of the Minister of Household Affairs broke out suddenly and ended quickly. There are various signs that His Majesty had already started investigating Han Ming a long time ago. Some careful people can calculate from the time that the days when spies were sent from the capital to investigate the 3 states of Bozhu and rushed back day and night were exactly the days when the accounts were settled by the Ministry of Accounts. In this way, gossip can no longer be called gossip. The new director Tang Ning, who has just arrived at the Ministry of Household Affairs, is indeed investigating the source of this corruption case. The case involves a wide range of things, which is rare in recent years. The apparent involvement has already caused a slight turmoil in the court. Some of the news that has not been revealed on the surface is even more frightening to think about. At the same time that Han Ming's case happened, His Majesty reprimanded King Duan inexplicably. It was said to be a reprimand, but the degree was more than reprimand. According to the news from the palace, His Majesty punished King Duan by breaking a punishment staff, and King Duan was punished not only by being banned from home for 3 months. It is said that most of the treasury of Prince Duan's mansion was emptied by the Forbidden Army. The flow of the money is not yet known, but in connection with Han Ming's case and His Majesty's heavy hand, the inside story is probably obvious. In recent days, King Duan's performance in the court has been somewhat inferior to that of King Kong. After this incident, it will be extremely difficult to reverse the situation. Many people have even concluded that King Kong and King Duan are the 2 kings. The overall situation has been decided. The gate of Prince Duan's mansion was closed tightly. Within 3 months, the main door was not opened, and the palace was deserted and desolate. However, Prince Kang's mansion was full of singing and dancing. King Kong looked at the dance of the dancers in the palace, breathed a sigh of relief, and said, "It turns out that Han Ming is Zhao Ming's man. It's so dangerous, so dangerous." Someone around him complimented him, "His Royal Highness is blessed by God, and any trouble will naturally turn into good fortune." "It's not God who depends on me this time." King Kong drank a glass of wine and said, "Fortunately Tang Ning didn't send that gift, otherwise, I would not be much better than Zhao Ming." The man thought for a while and said, "Your Highness, since Tang Ning already knew that Han Ming had a problem, why didn't he tell your Highness earlier?" A middle-aged man next to King Duan gave him a cold look and said, "This is a secret of the imperial court. If he can reveal it to His Highness casually, what will His Majesty think?" The man knew that he had said something wrong and said quickly, "My subordinate made a mistake. My subordinate made a mistake." "It makes sense." King Kong thought about it carefully and nodded, "This matter involves too much. If there is any leakage, my father will definitely investigate it strictly. It will be difficult for me to explain it at that time. Besides, this time it is Zhao Ming himself. Seeking death, whether I know it or not, is a good thing for me." He thought for a moment, then looked at the middle-aged man beside him and asked, "Mr. Su, what should we do next?" "We don't have to do anything," the middle-aged man said. "After this incident, King Duan has completely lost power in the court. As long as His Highness makes no mistakes, King Duan will have no chance. What's more, if we don't do it, someone will do it for us. Yes, Mr. Tang is now walking in the 6th division, and your Highness knows his abilities very well. With his enmity with the Tang family, will he let go of those people from the Tang family and Prince Duan in the 6th division?" King Kong thought for a while, patted his thigh, and said with a smile, "Sir, what you said makes sense. It has entered the winter months, and although it has not snowed yet, the weather is already a bit cold. In the small courtyard of Tianrunju, there are occasionally a few remaining leaves on the bare trees swaying in the wind, and the atmosphere seems a bit desolate." Su Mei was sitting on the swing in the courtyard. As the swing swung up and down, a small section of her smooth ankle was exposed from time to time. The breeze blowing around her body was slightly fragrant, diluting the bleak winter atmosphere in the courtyard. She was swinging on the swing, looking at Tang Ning, and asked, "Have you made up your mind to help King Kong win the heir apparent?" Even Su Mei, who was her pillow partner, felt this way, and Tang Ning felt that she was wronged. His relationship with King Kong is similar to the relationship where the enemy of his enemy is his friend. In the past, everyone got what they needed and used each other, but in fact they didn't help King Kong that much. But this time, Fang Zhe was the one who started the incident, and he was the one who benefited in the end. Han Ming died, and he was the biggest person in the household department besides the minister. Tang Ning was sure that before the new Minister of Household Affairs arrived, the entire household would be in trouble. Everyone in the household will be firmly grasped by him. King Kong was also a beneficiary. He did nothing but made the biggest profit. King Duan touched the bottom line of Emperor Chen this time and was probably deposed. King Kong sat at home and the throne came to him from the sky, but there was always something wrong with him. About the cake, I'm afraid I'll wake up laughing even in my dreams. As for Tang Ning herself, she didn't get any benefits after going through this incident, but she got the title of Broom Star. Tang Ning looked at her and asked, "What do you think of Prince Kong?" Su Mei's swing swayed lower and lower, and she said, "Please push the swing for me first." Tang Ning walked up behind her and asked her to start swinging again. Su Mei shook her calf and said, "Prince Kong doesn't have any great talents and is very mediocre, but he has very good luck. If you go against the Tang family, you go against Prince Duan, he is the one who benefits in the end." Tang Ning couldn't agree more with Su Mei's evaluation of King Kong. King Kong was not only mediocre, but also stingy. Being mediocre was fine. With capable ministers and assistants around him, he wouldn't make any big mistakes. But stingy people don't have enough structure and generally become successful. No big deal. Han Ming fell, King Duan was almost useless, and King Kong had already stepped into the East Palace, but he still hasn't expressed even a trace of gratitude, which can be seen from this. Tang Ning looked at her and suddenly asked, "Why do you think Han Ming turned to Prince Duan?" "What's so strange about this?" Su Mei glanced at him and said, "When Han Ming faced the entire treacherous prime minister group alone, the Tang family and concubine Tang Hui helped a lot in secret. Otherwise, he, a censor, would have been gnawed to pieces long ago." Tang Ning was surprised and said, "There is such a thing." Su Mei jumped down from the swing and said, "The Tang family relied on that opportunity to become the overlord of the court. In the past 10 years, they have worked hard to build the Tang family today. The Han family is the culprit of the fall of the treacherous prime minister. Although the treacherous prime minister has fallen, the remaining power cannot be underestimated. Why do you think the Han family has been able to live safely in the capital all these years?" Tang Ning thought for a while and asked, "He is not afraid of death, so why would he succumb to Prince Duan because of this?" "People always change." Su Mei looked at him and said, "Especially you men, who are fickle, fickle. You are willing to sleep with me now, can you guarantee that you can sleep with me in 10 years? A very serious question can also be diverted here by her." Tang Ning thought about it. 10 years later, Prince Duan may have completely fallen, and the Tang family has also completely fallen. Their family can appear openly, and he doesn't have to come here secretly every time. By that time, it seems that there is no reason to come here often. Tang Ning looked at her and said honestly, "I can't guarantee it." "You are so heartless." Su Mei stretched out her hand and pulled his ear, angrily saying, "I will rely on you for the rest of my life, 10, 20, 30 years. Imperial study. Your Majesty has been in a bad mood these 2 days. The eunuchs and palace maids serving in the palace are very cautious. They dare not breathe, and dare not make too much noise when walking. Even the courtiers who were summoned to the palace held their breath and did not dare to refute any words." Qianzhuo stepped forward and said, "Your Majesty, the position of the Right Assistant Minister of the Ministry of Revenue is now vacant." Emperor Chen waved his hand and said, "I haven't thought of a suitable candidate yet. The position of the Right Assistant Minister will be vacant for the time being." Qianzhuo nodded in agreement. Emperor Chen looked down again and said, "Tang Ning has been in the Ministry of Revenue for more than a month. You can discuss the order in which he will go to various ministries next." Many people below frowned when they heard this. Minister of Rights Tang Hui lowered his head and hung his hands without saying a word. The Minister of Justice looked around, looked at the Minister of Personnel, and said with a smile, "We don't need people in the Ministry of Justice for the time being, why don't we let him go to the Ministry of Personnel first?" The Minister of Personnel's eyelids twitched, and immediately said, "We don't need people in the Ministry of Personnel for the time being, why don't we let him go to the Ministry of Works?" The old man next to him stroked his beard, patted his ears, and asked, What did Lord Zhou say just now? What happened to our Ministry of Works?" Emperor Chen looked at the chaos below and his face darkened. Fortunate young gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 305. Tang Ning, compiled by Hanlin, only stayed in the Ministry of Revenue for more than a month, and he turned it into what it is now. Even the minister was removed by him. Thinking about his past behavior, how could the minds of several ministers be different? "I don't know, this is a big trouble at all. No matter which department he goes to, he will make him uneasy. No one wants to keep such a trouble around." Emperor Chen looked at the ministers below and said, "Whoever is willing to accept Tang Ning, please step forward." Song Yi, the minister of the Ministry of Justice, lowered his head, thinking that it would be better to stay as far away from the Ministry of Justice as possible for such troubles. The Ministry of Justice is not the richest or most powerful among the 6 departments, but it is the most troublesome. Once something big happens in the capital, the Ministry of Justice is not the richest or the most powerful. For important cases, in most cases, the criminal department is ordered to solve the case. Their criminal department is already chaotic enough on weekdays, so it is better not to add to the chaos. Very good. Since Song Iking requested it, let Tang Ning go to the criminal department next after she leaves the household department. Song Yi firmly believed in this idea when Chen Wang's voice came from above. His heart trembled, and he raised his head suddenly. When he looked around, he realized that the several ministers standing next to him just now took a small step back without knowing when. In this way, it seems like he took the initiative to stand up. He was stunned and said hurriedly, "Your Majesty." Emperor Chen looked at him and asked, "Why, does Song Iking still have questions?" Song Yi raised his head, gritted his teeth and said, "No, no." Chen Huang nodded with satisfaction and said, "In that case, let's arrange it this way." Everyone exited the imperial study room. The Minister of Civil Affairs looked at Song Yi and said, "Your Majesty has arranged such a capable person for your Ministry of Punishment. Mr. Song should be happy. Why do you look so unhappy?" "Humph, don't be too proud." Song Yi looked at him, snorted coldly, and said, "Your officials will not be able to escape sooner or later. Our criminal department is just some cases. Unlike your high-ranking officials, Joe sir, you should worry more about your officials." After he finished speaking, he simply waved his sleeves and left. Everyone dispersed, and the punishment department took over the problem, so they could have a few more months of leisure. Xingbu Yamen. Master Song. "Hello, sir. I've met my lord." Song Yi returned to the Ministry of Punishment. Along the way, officials from the Ministry of Punishment greeted him one after another. He walked into a check-in room somewhere, and an official stood up immediately and said, "Your Excellency is back." Song Yi looked at him and said, "Shilang Su, go and find all the doctors from all the departments." The official stood up and said, "I'm going to go now." The Xingbu Yamen was divided into 4 yamen, namely the Xingbu Yamen, Duguan Yamen, Bibu Yamen, and Simon Yamen. Not long after, Su Chang, the Minister of the Punishment Department, summoned all the doctors from the 4 yamen. After the 4 people walked in, they all bowed and saluted, "I have met the Lord Shangshu." Song Yi waved his hand and said, "I came to you this time to tell you something." His Majesty ordered the Hanlin Academy to compile 6 volumes of Tang Ning's travels. The next one to come is our Department of Punishment. As soon as this statement came out, the expressions of the 4 doctors in the government changed at the same time. The bad guy Tang Ning's name is as loud as a thunderbolt. He killed Shang Guan as soon as he arrived at the Hu department. So he's coming to the punishment department so soon? Song Yi looked at them and said, "Which one do you think is better for him to stay in?" "This is the Department of Punishment." Among the 4 departments, the main department, the Department of Punishment, is also headed. The doctor from Duguan, the doctor from Bibu, and the doctor from Simon looked at each other and said in unison, "The Department of Punishment." The lips of the doctor of the criminal department turned white and he was about to speak. The doctor of the Duguan stepped forward, cupped his hands and said, "Master Shangshu, Your Majesty ordered Tang Xiu to write 6 books in order to train him. According to the official's opinion, naturally the Ministry of Punishment is more suitable for him." Dr. Bibu agreed, "We don't have any important matters in our 3 yamen on weekdays. If Master Tang comes here, wouldn't it subvert His Majesty's original intention?" Dr. Simon agreed, "What you 2 adults said makes sense." Song Yi thought for a while, nodded and said, "In that case, Mr. Yang, let Tang Ning go to your department." Several doctors walked out of the room together. The doctor in charge looked at him, sighed and said, "Master Yang, take care." Dr. Bibu bowed his hands to him and said, be careful. Dr. Simon thought for a while, looked at him and said, Mr. Yang, eat something good these days, don't be stingy with money. You. The doctor from the criminal department pointed at them, his face turned red, but a few of them had already left. The doctor of the Ministry of Justice stood on the steps, his mind went blank. Of course he knew the record of this new champion. After he joined the household department, beating Shang Guan was no longer his peak. His most powerful thing was defeating Shang Guan to death. Even the minister of the Ministry of Finance was not immune, let alone a small minister of the Ministry of Justice. He thought for a while, gritted his teeth, took a deep breath, and when he walked down the steps, his feet stumbled, and he fell to the ground, holding his ankles, groaning in pain. The three doctors at the same time turned around and looked at the Xingbu doctor who was sitting on the ground with cold sweat on his forehead. One of them opened his mouth in disbelief and murmured, Master Yang, are you so cruel to yourself? A quarter of an hour later, in one of the rooms on duty in the Xingbu department, an old man touched the ankle of the Xingbu doctor. He suddenly exerted force, and the Xingbu doctor screamed and glared at him, be gentle. The old man smiled and asked, my lord, does it still hurt now? Yang Langzhong stood up, tried to take 2 steps, and looked at the old man with a dazed look on his face. Dr. Bibu smiled and said, this doctor is a famous bone-setting doctor in Beijing, so his methods are naturally superb. I didn't expect that this doctor's medical skills are so amazing. Yang Langzhong nodded and jumped on the spot. Everyone only heard a creak sound in their ears. Yang Langzhong fell to the ground again, holding his ankles, with a very expression on his face. Pain. After a while, cold sweat broke out on Langzhong's forehead. The old man withdrew his hand from his ankle and said, I'm afraid I injured my muscles and bones just now. I need to rest for at least half a month before I can recover. So long. Yang Langzhong shook his head and said resolutely, no, absolutely not. The Ministry of Justice is busy with affairs, how can I rest? Song Shangshu looked at him and said, I will grant you half a month's leave. Dr. Yang can recuperate at home. When everyone walked out of the check-in room, Mr. Yang looked down at his feet and murmured, half a month. Song Yi came to his office, his eyes looking thoughtful. Unlike the Ministry of Accounts, the criminal department is not involved in such big cases. Thinking about it carefully, it seems that he has nothing to cause trouble, but before this, who would have thought that he could settle an account in the Ministry of Accounts? Forget about the Minister of Justice, who can guarantee that he will not cause other troubles after coming to the Ministry of Punishments. If he caused trouble, wouldn't he have to ask him, the Minister of Punishment, to help him end it in the end? While he was thinking about this, someone suddenly walked in from outside and said in a panic, Master Shangshu, it's bad, Mr. Yang knocked over the hot water kettle and burned his foot. Tang Ning stood in the yard, holding a piece of paper in her hand. This piece of paper was passed from the palace, and it contained a handwriting. The content of the handwriting asked him to report to the Ministry of Punishments before mid-November. According to his plan, he still had 2 months to go to the Ministry of Household Affairs. Wait, ask for 2 months' leave, which coincides with the Chinese New Year. During the Chinese New Year, all major government offices will take half a month's leave, so that he will be free before the Lantern Festival. This decree completely disrupted his plan. He couldn't live in peace even a year ago. He was supposed to stay in the Ministry of Revenue until the end of the year. Qian Shangshu must have said something in front of the emperor again. He went home on vacation and this guy was still thinking of ways to drive him away. He was so unhappy. Looking forward to seeing you. Xiaoju walked in from outside the door and said, congratulations, you will soon become the head of the criminal department. Tang Ning looked at him and asked, you also know? It's my turn to be on duty in the imperial study today. Xiaoju looked at him and said, when several ministers almost fought over you, I was watching from the side. almost started a fight. Xiaoju nodded and said, "Your Majesty asked them to discuss which ministry you should go to next." Those ministers almost fought over this matter. Tang Ning looked at him and said in surprise, "They all rushed to get me, but in the end, the Minister of Punishment won the battle." Xiaoju looked at him, shook his head and said, "No, he lost." From Xiaoju's words, Tang Ning learned about the situation at that time and how disgusted he was now in the 6 movies. "That's unreasonable." He slapped his hand on the stone table. "This bastard Fang Jie used him to bring down Han Ming. He took advantage of it all, and let him bear the name of the Broom Star. He should keep this account in his heart first, and he must let it go in the future. He paid back double." Fortunate young gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 306. Emperor Chen initially said that he would stay in each of the 6 ministries for 3 months, but in fact, he only stayed in the Ministry of Revenue for more than a month before transferring to the Ministry of Justice. It seems that asking for leave openly will not be accepted by the emperor. Compared with the Ministry of Revenue and the Ministry of Personnel, the Ministry of Justice has much less work. I don't know what position the Ministry of Justice will assign him. It would be best if it is an idle position. After he stays there for a long time, he can leave without a pat on the butt. The hat of the jinx who specifically defeats his superiors will naturally be taken off. The emperor said that before mid-November, Tang Ning would naturally not disobey the imperial edict, and he reported to the Ministry of Justice as early as November 9. He was received by a minister named Su Cheng of the Ministry of Justice. Unlike the Ministry of Revenue, the Ministry of Justice only has one minister. After Su Cheng took him to the Ministry of Justice, he left in a hurry, as if he was in a hurry. Although the Ministry of Justice where he worked had the most affairs among the 4 yamen of the Ministry of Justice, it was much less busy than the Ministry of Revenue. The Ministry of Justice, which was responsible for adjudicating cases, did not have to try cases every day, because there were also Ping'an County Yamen and Jingzhou Prefecture Yamen under it. Unless it was a case of life or a case specially arranged by His Majesty, the Ministry of Justice would not accept those trivial cases. An official bowed to him and said respectfully, "I am the Deputy Minister of the Ministry of Justice, and I meet Tang Zushi." Tang Ning met the Deputy Minister of the Ministry of Justice, and then showed his face in front of the Lingxi and Zhanggu of the Ministry of Justice. He looked around and asked, "Where is the Lord Langzhong?" The Deputy Minister of the Ministry of Justice said, "The Lord Langzhong was injured a few days ago and went home to recuperate." In the Ministry of Justice, except for the doctor of the Ministry of Justice, he was the most senior. Now that the doctor of the Ministry of Justice went home to recuperate, he became the head of the Ministry of Justice. Although this means that all matters of the Ministry of Justice will have to go through his hands, which is a bit troublesome, but since the doctor of the Ministry of Justice is not in the yamen, there will be no one who says that he is a jinx who defeats his superiors, right? The officials of the Ministry of Justice dispersed, and someone in a duty room whispered, "The rumors outside that Tang Zushi is a jinx are true. He is coming to the Ministry of Justice." Yang Shilang sprained his ankle twice in the same day and was scalded by hot water. "I heard that he needs to rest for at least 3 months. Someone immediately echoed, "It's too dangerous. We should be careful too." The Ministry of Justice where Tang Ning works is in charge of criminal law and prisons. There are no major cases on weekdays, and he leaves daily affairs to the Yuan Weilang to take care of. There was nothing to do for several days, just writing manuscripts and reading books in the duty room. Reading idle books, Song Yi, the minister of the Ministry of Justice, said without even raising his head, "Reading idle books is better than looking for trouble." Does Minister Su want him to look for trouble? Minister Su Cheng's eyelids jumped. The last time he looked for trouble, he had already caused the Ministry of Revenue to lose a minister. He didn't want to follow the old path of the Minister of Revenue. Although he was in the Ministry of Justice, it was difficult to be an official in the capital. Many times, he had to consider comprehensively. He didn't dare to say that every matter he handled was righteous. Just in case, it would be better not to take the initiative to provoke that person. As soon as Su Cheng walked into the duty room, a clerk from the Ministry of Justice hurried forward and bowed, saying, "Sir Su, someone reported a case." Su Cheng frowned and asked, "Who reported the case and what was it about?" The Ministry of Justice was the highest department in charge of punishment in the state of Chen. All major cases in the country had to be summarized in the Ministry of Justice for review, but the Ministry of Justice did not often try cases on weekdays. There are county yamen and prefectural yamen in the capital. These two yamen can handle more than 90% of the cases. The remaining 10% is the most difficult. According to the rules, the cases that these two yamen cannot handle will be handed over to the Ministry of Justice. However, not often hearing cases does not mean that they will not hear cases. It's just that those trivial cases are usually blocked outside by the guards. Once they are reported, they must be serious cases. But in general, these serious cases are easier to handle than those handed over by the county yamen and prefectural yamen. The clerk of the Ministry of Revenue said, "A wealthy businessman in the west of the city found his wife hanging at home this morning, so he came to the Ministry of Justice to report the case." Hanging, compared with homicide cases, suicide cases are much simpler. They often only need to be filed with the Ministry of Justice without too much investigation. Su Cheng thought about it and said, "Let the people of the Ministry of Justice handle it." Tang Ning received his first case within 2 days of coming to the Ministry of Justice. The official of the Ministry of Justice looked at him and said, "Master Tang, this case is simple. It is probably that the people of the Ministry of Justice will go and investigate. If there is no accident, the case can be transferred to the county government after the case is determined." Tang Ning thought about it, then nodded and said, "Then let's go." Although he had seen dead people, at that time, his life was threatened, and he could not care about it, but in fact, he still had some fear of corpses in his heart. The deceased was a wealthy businessman in the west of the city. He had been drinking outside all night last night. When he came back in the morning, he found that his wife had hanged herself in the room. Tang Ning simply asked about the case and walked out of the Ministry of Justice. He saw a group of people coming in. Zhao Man waved to him from a distance and asked, "Hey, where are you going?" Not only Zhao Man was there, but even Chen Huang changed into ordinary clothes. There were only 0 and countless times of incognito visits. Chen Huang liked to play this tune more and more recently. Tang Ning stepped forward, clasped his hands in cooperation, and said, "Sir, there is a case in the west of the city, and we are planning to investigate." Emperor Chen looked at him with an interested expression on his face, and said, "Let's go with us to have a look." Investigating a case is not about watching the fun, but Tang Ning couldn't just say that they were going out for business this time and let them stay wherever they wanted, so he had to go with them. When they arrived at the scene of the crime, the body had been untied from Bailing, but the officers from the criminal department who had left first still had some skills in handling cases and did not let anyone else enter the room. Zhao Man hid behind Chen Huang and only dared to take a sneak peek. A clerk was asking about the case in detail. Tang Ning walked into the room, looked around, and finally looked at Bailing. He leaped into the air, grabbed a beam above with one hand, and jumped down after a moment. Things like climbing over a wall or going to a house are no longer trivial to him now. Zhao Man glanced into the room and immediately opened his eyes when he saw this scene. Tang Ning walked out of the room, squatted down, and lifted the white cloth on the ground. Zhao Man immediately closed her eyes again. At this time, the clerk had finished asking and said, "Sir, the deceased is the wife of a wealthy businessman named Hu. She was found dead at home this morning. The time of death should be midnight yesterday. Last night, Hu was out drinking and stayed up all night. Return, the work has been examined, and it is determined that he hanged himself. A well-built man knelt on the ground, with runny nose and tears, and cried, "Madam, isn't it good for you to tell me something? Why are you so hard to think about?" "She didn't hang herself." Tang Ning shook her head and said, "She was strangled to death first, and then she pretended to have hanged herself." Emperor Chen took a step forward, looked at him, and asked, "How do you determine that she did not hang herself, but was murdered?" Tang Ning shook her head and said, "This was not said by the official, but by the deceased himself." "Ah, damn, can dead people talk?" Zhao Man screamed and ran away immediately. Chen Huang looked at him with doubt in his eyes and asked, "How can a dead man speak?" "Not only can the dead speak, but they are often more credible than what the living say." Tang Ning looked at him and said, "Anyone who hangs himself will struggle violently before death, which will cause the white silk to roll on the beam, causing the beam to collapse. There are changes in the dust in many places. If there is only a trace of dust, it means that the victim was moved here after death. Only based on this, can we conclude that she did not hang herself." Chen Huang looked at him and asked doubtfully, "What if she wanted to die and didn't struggle?" "It is human nature to struggle when hanging yourself." Tang Ning shook her head, pointed at the corpse, and said, "Besides, people who really hanged themselves also have many external manifestations, such as closed eyes, open lips, holding hands, exposed teeth, and strangulation. The marks are deep purple, the tongue is stuck to the teeth when hanging on the throat, and the tongue is protruding below the throat. There is drool on the chest, and there is feces behind the buttocks. If someone is beaten and strangled to pretend to hang himself, the mouth and eyes will be open, and the hands will be open. Scattered, the blood vessels under the throat are weak, the traces are light, the tongue cannot come out, and it cannot reach the teeth." He did not pause and continued, "Although the marks on the neck of this corpse are deep, the mouth and eyes are open, the hands are scattered, the tongue cannot come out, and the teeth are not touching. It should be that someone strangled him and pretended to hang himself. Therefore, this should be a case of suicide, a murder, not a suicide." After hearing the words, the man thought about it carefully and suddenly said, "What this gentleman said makes sense. I have been doing autopsies for many years and have seen many people who hanged themselves. It seems that it is exactly what this gentleman said, and this corpse is somewhat different." This chapter is first published like Have Voice Novel Network. Please remember the URL. You are listening to novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Fortunate Young Gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 307. Emperor Chen pondered over it carefully and felt that what Tang Ning said made sense. He looked at him and asked, "How come you understand all this?" If he didn't understand all this, then all his reading of Young Justice Bao and the Judge of the Song Dynasty would be in vain. He also bought a copy of Zhuangjilu before, and although he only flipped through a few pages, he still remembered some of the content. Tang Ning looked at Emperor Chen and smiled, "My lord, you forgot that I am also a doctor. If you hadn't said that, I would have forgotten." Emperor Chen looked at him strangely. It was because he had too many identities: the new champion, a crazy poet, a Hanlin editor, the head of the Ministry of Revenue, the head of the Ministry of Justice. It would have been fine if he had so many identities, but he was also good at one thing: he passed the imperial examinations and was the best poet, he was the most knowledgeable Hanlin in the Hanlin Academy, he was able to propose new laws to fight corruption in the Ministry of Revenue, and he was so proficient in investigating cases in the Ministry of Justice. In this case, who would have remembered that in addition to these identities, he was also the uncle of the imperial physician? After hearing these words, the wealthy businessman surnamed who had already burst into tears and collapsed to the ground, crying, "My lord, you have to make a decision for me and my wife." After all, Tang Ning was not a detective. After asking about the situation of the maids and servants in the Hu mansion, he did not get any useful information, so he could only order the Ministry of Justice to file a record and investigate. When they came out of Hu's house, Emperor Chen casually said, "Minister Fang has applied to me to promote the wonderful methods you taught to the accountant in the Ministry of Revenue. I think this method is of great benefit to the court and has approved it. If Minister Fang comes to you, you must help him promote this method." Tang Ning cursed Fang Zhe in his heart. He used him when he was in the Ministry of Revenue. Now that he has left the Ministry of Revenue, he is still looking for trouble for him. He cursed Fang Zhe in his heart, but he still had to smile on his face and nodded, saying, "I obey your order." Emperor Chen did not go back to the Ministry of Revenue. He returned to the palace halfway. Zhao Yingying followed him back. When he went back, Tang Ning saw that her face was a little pale. This girl is so timid. It is estimated that she will not be able to eat for a few days this time. Tang Ning walked back to his duty room. A clerk walked to the door of Minister Su's duty room, knocked on the door, and walked in. Minister Su glanced at him and asked, "Why, is the case closed?" "No," the clerk glanced at him and said, "Director Tang concluded that it was not a suicide case, but a homicide case, and ordered the people from the Ministry of Justice to investigate." "Homicide case?" Minister Su raised his head again and asked, "How did he conclude it?" The clerk recounted what had just happened. Minister Su was stunned for a moment, then waved his hand and said, "Forget it, let the people from the Ministry of Justice investigate." Generally speaking, the handling methods of suicide cases and homicide cases are completely different. The former only needs to be filed with the Ministry of Justice and then it can be left alone. The latter is much more troublesome. It is difficult to solve 1 out of 10 such cases. The Ministry of Justice has too many backlogs, and one more will not hurt. He thought of something and said, "Have all the cases that needed to be reviewed in various places last month been sent?" The clerk nodded and said, "They have all been sent, but the Ministry of Justice has not reviewed them yet." Minister Su looked at him and said, "Then take it to the Ministry of Justice for review first." Tang Ning was sitting in the duty room. It was time to eat, but he had just seen the corpse in the morning. Although he was not as scared as Zhao Yingying and his face turned pale, he still couldn't eat. A clerk brought in a large stack of files and said, "Sir, these are case files sent from various places. Please review them as soon as possible, my lord, the minister." Put it down anyway, he had no appetite, so Tang Ning simply opened a file and started reading it. The court still attaches great importance to human life. Even if the prisoner is sentenced to death, he must be reviewed by the Ministry of Justice and then by the Emperor himself before the final judgment will be made. In the Ministry of Justice, these files must at least pass through 2 checkpoints, the Ministry of Justice and the Minister of Justice. As long as anyone thinks that there is a problem in any link of the case, it will be sent back for retrial. These files include witness testimony, coroner's autopsy report, and record documents of local county offices. He read through the 11 files one by one, leaving only 2, stacking the other 9 together, calling the clerk and saying, "Send these files for retrial." The clerk looked at him and said in surprise, "These, all sent for retrial?" Tang Ning nodded and said, "All sent. Except for these 2 files, the rest of the files either had insufficient evidence or problems with the autopsy reports. If it were any other case, it would be fine, but these were all murder cases. If he moved his fingers, one person would not survive until next autumn, and there was no room for negligence. Perhaps the people in the Ministry of Justice did not think so, but as the only department among the 6 departments that directly controlled the life and death of the people, it had to exercise its power with caution. The clerk looked at Tang Ning and nodded, "I obey your order." Tang Ning was actually very familiar with the case trial process of the county government, and knew very well where the defects of the local government offices in investigating cases were. There is a sentence in Zhuangjilu, nothing is more important than the death penalty, nothing is more important than the initial case, and nothing is more important than the initial case investigation. Tang Ning remembers this sentence very clearly. This sentence means that among all cases, nothing is more important than a murder case, and nothing is more important than clarifying the initial case when investigating a murder case. To clarify the initial case, the inspection is the most important link. Chen Guo did not have the collection of clearing wrongs, and the autopsy of the deceased was still at a very early stage. Similar to the case this morning, if placed in any local county office, it would probably be simply judged as suicide. This would be a problem for the government. It is enough to save trouble, but there are a lot of unjust cases among the people, and many innocent people will even die as a result. Although he was a bit naive and the kind of person who needed to be pushed around, he still planned to take the initiative to do something in this matter. He didn't finish reading the collection of wrongs at that time, mainly because the content was too exciting and he couldn't eat after reading too much. Although he regretted it now, it was too late. He could only write down what he had read first. Due to the limitations of the conditions and ideological understanding at that time, there are also some unscientific things in the collection of abandoned wrongs, but it is undeniable that those small flaws cannot cover up the value of this book. Tang Ning's knowledge of forensic medicine was limited to what she saw on TV series, but having a systematic forensic book was not enough. After finishing writing the contents of the collection of redress of wrongs that he had seen, and also jotting down some fragments of what he had seen in the TV series, he put down his pen, summoned a clerk, and ordered, "Report the work of the widows of various yamen in Jiangxi province. Make a copy of the list for me." Although the clerk didn't know what Tang Ning wanted to do with the list, he still nodded and said, "Yes, I will get it done right away." In terms of autopsy experience, he naturally cannot compare with these co-workers. They are all passed down from generation to generation, and each of them may have some unique secret skills. Summarizing these and then screening them will have a greater effect than him alone. This was a major event that benefited the world. Tang Ning was rare and did not slack off. He recalled the various detective dramas he had watched. This was a very mentally consuming thing and required a lot of energy, but he had really been busy in the past 2 days. "I have no appetite and can only force myself to eat a lot of things." Halfway through the strange case of Shigong, he went to the kitchen to steal 2 steamed buns, and was about to go back and finish the second half. When he walked into the check-in room, he saw Zhao Man sitting in his seat. Seeing him come in, he glanced at him, said, "What story have you written recently and you didn't tell me?" She held a thin book in her hand and was looking at it with interest. Tang Ning was a little surprised. Zhao Yingying was still a bit brave and could read the heavy content with gusto. He took a bite of the steamed bun. Zhao Man looked up at him, his face turned pale. When he saw the steamed bun in his hand, his complexion became even paler. He covered his chest and said, "Ugh." Tang Ning had been reluctant to eat in recent days. When she heard her voice, her stomach suddenly turned, vomit. Fortunate Young Gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 308. Zhao Man covered her mouth and said in a vague voice, How could you write such disgusting things?" The practical significance of this collection of redress of wrongs was far greater than those of those books. Zhao Yingying didn't understand it. Tang Ning didn't argue with her and took the book from her hand. He had spent all his efforts in the past few days. This is up. With this book, police officers all over the world will know how to investigate cases, and perpetrators will know how to conduct autopsies. I don't know how many unjust cases will be reduced in the world. Tang Ning looked at her and asked, "That day, someone was killed. Do you still remember the woman who killed and pretended to have committed suicide?" Zhao Man nodded with a pale face. Tang Ning continued, "If it were a policeman who didn't know how to investigate the case that day, and a coward who was not good at studying, wouldn't there be another innocent soul in the capital?" Over the past few decades, there are countless innocent souls floating in the sky of the capital. Maybe there are also ones in the princess's Changning palace. They float above the palace every day and look at you no matter what time. Stop talking, Zhao Man covered his mouth in horror and said in a panic, there are no ghosts in my Changning palace. Tang Ning took her hand away and said, I'm just talking. Princess, don't take it seriously. Then, write it quickly. Zhao Man's face turned pale and she looked at him and said, when you finish writing it, there will be fewer unjust cases and fewer innocent souls in the world. Tang Ning had a look of embarrassment on her face and said, but now I'm in trouble. Zhao Man immediately asked, what's the difficulty? The difficulty Tang Ning encountered was naturally that he had limited knowledge. However, he was the head of the household department with a low official rank. He wanted to summon all the widows in the Jiangyi region to come to Beijing and ask them to contribute their housekeeping skills passed down from generation to generation. It was difficult. Still a little big. What's so difficult about this? Zhao Man looked at him and said, I beg my father to issue an imperial edict. If they don't come, I'll slap them on the wall and swell their butts to see if they come. This is a good idea. As the head of the criminal department, Tang Ning does not have the authority to report directly to the emperor. It is troublesome to submit the report to the emperor. It is far less convenient and faster than Zhao Yingying's words. He cupped his hands to Zhao Man and said, thank you very much, princess. Zhao Man waved her hand and said, no need to thank me, I am helping the people of the world, not you. In the imperial study room, after Emperor Chen heard what Zhao Man said, he thought for a moment and nodded, it makes sense. If the people in the government agencies who investigate cases can be as meticulous as him, there will be fewer unjust cases in the world. During this period, the Hanlin Academy was ordered to prepare a decree and send it to the government offices in Jiangyi province at once, so that the officials from each government office should go to the capital within half a month without any mistakes. He stood up from his seat and said slowly, the new algorithm of the Ministry of Accounts has been implemented, and the accounting will be much faster in the future. First, it is the Ministry of Accounts, and then the Ministry of Punishments. It seems that I asked him to walk in the 6 departments in the first place. He is really the right decision. When Zhao Man heard this, he curled his lips and said, is that guy that powerful? Although he is not familiar with officialdom, he can always put forward practical strategies for governing the country. Emperor Chen said with some regret, if he is not married, I can recruit him as my consort. In this way, not only will his connection with my royal family be the closer we are, manner, you can also find a good home. I think you like him quite a lot. Who likes him? Upon hearing this, Zhao Man suddenly blushed and said, he is so lustful and has a lot of women around him. I don't want him to be a consort. I don't like him at all. Chen Huang looked at her and asked, you don't like him but you still help him like this. I am doing this to save the common people from suffering injustice. Zhao Man clutched the corner of his clothes and said, besides, he already has 2 wives, how could I possibly like him? I'm going back to the palace. She trotted all the way back to the palace, her face slightly red, whether from exhaustion or embarrassment. She lay on the bed, burying her head in the quilt, and a figure appeared in her mind. Although she liked playing and talking with that guy very much, when it came to marrying her, she had not thought carefully about getting married. Even if she really wanted to marry, she would not marry a married man. She shook her head and waved that figure away from her mind, and then she blushed and thought about what the person she would marry in the future should look like. He should be good at both civil and military skills, be handsome, be able to write good stories, play with her, and stand up to protect her when she is in danger. Zhao Yingying is quite reliable in her work. After Tang Ning entrusted her with the matter, several people came to the Ministry of Punishment to report on it. Because the emperor personally gave the order, they all performed their duties very conscientiously and said everything they knew. Especially after knowing that they can sign their names in this book, they are even more motivated. These people have been working for generations, and their sons inherit their father's business and pass it on from generation to generation. Even if they don't have the concept of forensic medicine, the experience accumulated by each of their families for thousands of years is a valuable asset with great reference value. During the entire month when she took office in the Ministry of Punishments, Tang Ning was busy compiling the resolution of wrongs and discussing specific cases with the co-workers. During this period, Zhao Yingying came once and listened to what they talked about for a while, and then stopped talking. Never been here. Zhao Yingying helped him a lot in this matter. Tang Ning was not one to repay a favor. Next time she asked him to accompany her shopping and talk to her, he would not refuse, and he would not let Xiao Tao scare her with snakes again. During this month, officials of all ranks in the Ministry of Revenue had a great change in their impression of the new Tang. They all said that he was a troublemaker, especially that he liked to pick fights with his superiors, but in the past month, he stayed quietly in the duty room, and handled the official business that needed him to handle in an orderly manner, which was very inconsistent with the rumors from the outside world. After Tang Ning sorted out all the information, it was already mid-December. The court would pay for the engraving and printing of this book, and it would also be promoted in government offices in various places, especially coroners, who were required to learn it. Correspondingly, the Ministry of Justice should also add a few more clauses to the legal provisions, increase the weight of inspection in the case trial process, and establish a complete accountability mechanism. When these are completed, it should be after the new year. There was not much that Tang Ning needed to do, so he simply asked for leave from the Minister of the Ministry of Justice, on the grounds of finding materials for compiling the book. The Minister of the Ministry of Justice approved him for half a month, and with the statutory holidays from the 1st to the 15th day of the first lunar month, he had a whole month of vacation. It was just before the end of the year. Xiru and Xiao Ai had already started to prepare for the new year. Tang Ning had been busy for more than a month and finally had some free time to rest. Tianrunju, Su Mei's residence. Tang Ning was lying on the lawn in the backyard, while Su Mei was sitting in the pavilion. The sound of the flute in her hand was clear and distant, and it was refreshing to listen to. Her music could bewitch people and was called magic music, but it could also soothe people's moods, cultivate their sentiments, and make people forget all their troubles temporarily, as if their souls had left their bodies and were floating around the world with her music. After the song, Tang Ning opened his eyes and asked, "On New Year's Eve, I want to take my mother over. Do you want to go with me?" Su Mei put down the flute in her hand and said, "New Year's Eve is a reunion for your family. What am I going to do?" Tang Ning put her hands behind her head and said, "A sister is also a sister. Don't treat yourself as an outsider. If not an outsider, what is she?" Su Mei glanced at him and asked, "My wife." Fortunate young gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 309. My wife. Tang Ning sat up from the grass and said, "Don't be so naughty." "What?" Su Mei stood up, walked in front of him, looked him in the eye, and asked, "Do you think I'm not worthy of you? Is there any man in the world who is not worthy of the most beautiful woman in the capital?" Tang Ning took a step back and said, "But don't forget that we are siblings." "I did it." Su Mei turned around and walked out of the yard, looking back and said, "Since you invited me so kindly, I will go reluctantly. In fact, many women are so face-conscious. They always refuse to do things they want, and then invite again, and refuse again. After refusing 2 or 3 times, they reluctantly pretend that they agree to give you face. Tang Yejing has always been like this." After leaving Tianrunju, Tang Ning walked on the street and saw a line of carriages coming from a distance. The pattern on the carriage looked familiar. The next moment he remembered where the pattern came from. This is the convoy of the Chu envoys. He almost subconsciously stopped the convoy. The guards in the convoy immediately drew their weapons and shouted, "Who is ahead? Why are you blocking the road?" "I am a compiler in the Hanlin Academy." Tang Ning glanced at a Chu official on horseback and said, "Are you envoys from Chu?" When he heard that the person blocking the road was an official from the Chen state, the man's face immediately improved a lot and said, "I wonder what important matter this lord is blocking the road for." Tang Ning looked at the man on horseback and said, "If it is not an urgent military situation, you need to dismount to enter the city. Although you are envoys, you should abide by the rules of the Chen state." The envoy on horseback, upon hearing this, I immediately turned over and bowed, saying, "Thank you for reminding me, sir. This is our first time in Beijing and we don't know the rules. I'm really sorry." "It's okay. Just pay attention next time." Tang Ning waved his hand casually and asked, "I have some friendship with your Chu state's little li. I wonder if he came on this mission." The official thought for a while and shook his head. "There is no colleague named Li on this mission." Even though he knew that with Li Tianlan's status, he should not be on a mission twice in a row, but he still felt a little melancholy when he heard the Chu state envoy confirm it in person. After saying goodbye to the Chu state envoy, he went home directly. He didn't plan to do anything else before the new year. The books in the bookstore have not been selling well these 2 days, but the wine is selling very well. The wine they brewed has entered the market of the capital and occupied a large market share. It has always been in short supply. During this period, King Kong sent him invitations to banquets several times. Tang Ning went once and declined them all. It is not uncommon for King Kong to hold banquets every day. King Kong is undoubtedly at the peak of his career. After the incident with the Ministry of Revenue, King Duan has already lost half of his reputation. King Huai has never had a sense of existence. In addition, His Majesty has rewarded him twice, whether intentionally or unintentionally. Many people in the court, including King Kong himself, believe that King Kong has already stepped into the East Palace. Countless people in the court began to show goodwill to King Kong. Those who used to be fence-sitters gradually began to lean towards him. The families in the capital that were originally tied to King Kong straightened their backs and even got a little carried away. As a result, within half a month, Ping and County Yamen handled 3 fights between the children of the powerful in the capital. Fortunately, my father-in-law has the token granted by the emperor, so he is not afraid of the pressure from those families. It is because the number of people in the capital has increased dramatically as the new year approaches, and the pressure to maintain public order every day is not small. However, no matter how busy he is, he still came early on New Year's Eve. The house was particularly lively today. Not to mention their family, including the father-in-law and mother-in-law, the third uncle and the third aunt, as well as Tang Yejing and Tang Keshan, who celebrated together every New Year's Eve. This year, Su Mei also came reluctantly. Of course, there was also the old beggar who relied on his status as a little master to eat and drink for free. Tonight, all the maids in the mansion were given a day off by Tang Ning, so they could go out and wander around. The inner house was full of family members. Xiaoi and the others were busy preparing dinner for the evening. Tang Ning and Xing'er were sitting in the pavilion making dumplings. Xiao Tao, who came with Su Mei, wanted to join in, but was driven away by Tang Ning without hesitation. She played with snakes all day long, and Tang Ning couldn't swallow the dumplings she made with a clear conscience. Xiao Tao was indignant about this and stood behind them with her hands on her hips. After a while, Su Mei came over after washing her hands and said, "I'll help you make dumplings too." Watching her make a dumpling, Tang Ning took the bowl of stuffing in front of her and said, "Why don't you just stand aside and watch?" Su Mei looked at Xiao Tao and asked, "Xiao Tao, is my dumpling ugly?" Xiao Tao remained silent and lowered her head to play with her Xiao Cheng. After suffering a series of blows, Su Mei was unwilling to make dumplings anymore and went to Tang Ning's bookstore to sleep. Today was the only day she could sleep here. She slept until Tang Ning woke her up for the New Year's Eve dinner. In 2 lives, this was probably the most lively New Year's Eve dinner Tang Ning had ever eaten. I wonder if next year will be more lively than this year. During the meal, Su Mei took the initiative to challenge Tang Yaoyao to a drinking contest. Although Tang Yaoyao's alcohol tolerance was not as good as Su Mei's, she gave Su Mei the strongest wine they had brewed, and she drank a much lower alcohol content. As a result, both of them were drunk and unconscious. Tang Ning held Xiao Xiao's hand and stood in the yard. When fireworks lit up in the direction of the palace, time had officially entered the early years of Ding Yuan from the 24th year of Xin Yuan in Chen State. A few months ago, Emperor Chen discussed with his ministers and decided to change the reign title. This was the first time that the reign title had been changed since Emperor Chen ascended the throne. The monarch and his ministers generally believed that the current Chen state had reached a new level of national strength. Now that the grasslands situation had been settled, the country of Chen was also full of vitality and prosperity. Changing the reign title at this time meant that the current Chen state had officially entered a new era. Tang Ning got up early the next day to attend the court meeting held on the first day of each year. In the first year of the change of the reign title, the court meeting was particularly important. All officials above the 6th rank in the capital had to participate. Although Tang Ning did not have to attend the court on weekdays, he could not be absent today. There were so many officials in the Chen state. During the court meeting, officials from all over the country would rush to the capital. With so many people, there was no palace in the palace where they could stand. Those below the 6th rank could basically only stand outside and blow the cold wind. Fortunately, in a noble place like the Hanlin Academy, although the official position was not very high and there was no real power, the status was not low. Tang Ning, a 6th rank Hanlin editor, could stand in front of the 5th rank officials when attending the court. The court meeting had many participants and took a long time. After 2 hours, it was still not over. Tang Ning clearly noticed that several officials around him had turned pale. In this case, even if they could not feel their legs, they had to stand until the end of the court meeting. If they moved around and were seen by the censor, they might lose their hard-earned official hats. Announced the envoys of Chu to see the emperor. After being tortured by the Tang fairy for a long time, standing for 2 hours was nothing to him. He was just a little sleepy. He vaguely heard the envoys of Chu enter the hall and say something loudly. Princess Pingyang is prudent, gentle, and kind, and graceful. We are ordered by the emperor to marry Princess Pingyang on behalf of His Royal Highness the Crown Prince. May the two countries be forever connected. Tang Ning's eyes suddenly opened at a certain moment. He didn't quite believe his ears and looked at the envoys of Chu in the middle of the hall. The Chu envoy came to Beijing to ask for marriage. Tang Ning hadn't reacted until the court meeting ended and the officials left one after another. He swore that he was just saying it casually at the time and definitely didn't mean to jinx her. Now, Zhao Yingying didn't marry to the grassland for a peace marriage, but for her, marrying far away in the grassland and marrying far away in Chu didn't seem to be much different. He was thinking about this in his heart. When he passed by a palace, he was suddenly grabbed by the wrist and pulled to a corner. Zhao Man looked at him with a smile, pinched the hem of her skirt and turned around, and asked proudly, "Do you think my new clothes are good?" You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Fortunate Young Gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 310. Chapter 308 of the main text of Ruyi Little Man. The Emperor is ruthless. Tang Ning has met many princes from the Chen royal family, including Prince Duan, Prince Kong, and Prince Huai. Not to mention their character and abilities, based on ordinary people's aesthetics look, their looks are also outstanding. Even Prince Run, who has a broad heart and a fat body, is pretty handsome. Before he lost weight, he had already attracted the attention of many palace students. Once he lost weight, he would surely be a scourge to the capital. The concubines who can be included in the harem are all beauties carefully selected from major families. From generation to generation, it is not easy for the royal family to produce a few weird and cracked dates. Although the Princess Zhao Yingying has a bit of a bad temper, her appearance cannot be criticized. She looks petite and cute, although she is actually not petite or cute at all. On the first day of the new year, she put light makeup on her face, wore a pleated Ruyi Moon skirt, and a Linxia bun. The crystal light in her hair was shining. She didn't know how many beads she had on her hairpin. It seems to have a more bling feeling. Zhao Man was dressed up beautifully this morning and wanted to show off, so she came over to block Tang Ning, but she didn't expect him to be indifferent. She was slightly annoyed and said dissatisfiedly, "Hey, I'm talking to you." It has to be said that regardless of her princess temperament, Zhao Yingying can be regarded as a little beauty. Tang Ning came back to her senses and nodded, "It's beautiful." Normally, he might have hit her a few times, but today he didn't have that intention. Just now, the Chu state envoy asked for marriage on the spot. Although Chen Huang did not give an immediate reply, Tang Ning was not the first brother to enter the court. If Chen Huang did not agree, he would definitely reject it on the spot. We will discuss it later. Even if it does not mean that he agrees, it also shows that there is still room for discussion on the matter. She is so happy now, but when she hears the news, she may just cry. You have a good sense. Zhao Man was finally satisfied. She turned the corner of her skirt and said, "This is fabric from Jiangnan. It is made by the maid with the best craftsmanship in the palace." After showing off her new clothes and getting the results she wanted, Zhao Man waved her hand generously and said, "Okay, you must be very tired after standing for so long in the morning. Go back and rest." "I'm not tired." Tang Ning shook her head. Although he and Zhao Yingying had some disagreements at first, they are now considered friends. It seemed a bit unreasonable to leave her behind at this time. He looked at Zhao Man and asked, "Princess, are we friends?" Zhao Man glanced at him and said, "Barely, it will be an advantage for you to be my princess's friend." Tang Ning looked at her and asked, "Since we are friends, can I ask the princess a question?" Zhao Man said casually, "Ask." Tang Ning thought for a while and asked, "What kind of person does the princess want to marry in the future?" Zhao Man's face turned red. "Why do you ask this?" Tang Ning waved her hand and said, "It's just out of curiosity. If the princess finds it inconvenient, just forget it." "Forget it? What's the inconvenience of saying this?" Zhao Man thought for a while and then said generously, "The person I want to marry is better looking than you, better in literary talent than you, and better in martial arts than you. The most important thing is that you won't always be angry with me like you." Tang Ning finally understood why she still couldn't get married. The person she liked didn't exist in this world. If she didn't lower her standards a little, she would only be an old girl for the rest of her life. "Why did you suddenly ask me this?" Zhao Man seemed to realize something, and suddenly looked at him suspiciously and asked, "Are you hiding something from me?" At this point, there was no point in making insinuations. Tang Ning could only tell the truth. He looked at Zhao Man and said, "I heard some news during the court meeting just now." Zhao Man's heart skipped a beat and she immediately asked, "What's the news?" "The envoys from Chu State came to Beijing a few days ago." Tang Ning paused before continuing, "They came to propose marriage to His Majesty." Zhao Man was startled at first, and then his face immediately turned pale. She was the only unmarried princess of the royal family's age. Who else could they ask for in marriage? He looked at Tang Ning, raised his hand and hit him, and said, "Don't scare me. If you scare me, I will let my father hit you." She said threatening words, but her voice became lower and lower. Tang Ning sighed softly and said, "At the court meeting just now, the Chu envoy has formally proposed for marriage, but His Majesty has not agreed yet." Zhao Man stood there blankly for a moment, then quickly ran towards the imperial study room. Tang Ning watched her disappear, sighed again, turned around and took 2 steps, then stopped and stood still. At the door of the royal study, a eunuch stopped Zhao Man and said hurriedly, "Your Highness, please wait a moment. I will go and inform your Majesty." Zhao Man pushed him away, pushed the palace door open hard, and strode in. Chen Huang sat at the table, looked up at her, and asked, "Manner, what do you want from me?" Zhao Man raised her head and said in a trembling voice, "Does your father want to marry me to the Chu kingdom?" Emperor Chen looked at him and said, "I and the courtiers will discuss this matter carefully. You can wait for news in the palace." Zhao Man trembled and suddenly felt cold all over. How could she not understand the meaning of the discussion? What they were discussing was not whether she should marry or not, but what benefits and bargaining chips the court could get from her marriage. She knelt on the ground and said sadly, "Father, I don't want to marry to the Chu kingdom. How can we treat national affairs as trivial matters?" Emperor Chen looked at her and said, "You are not only my daughter, but also the princess of the Chen kingdom. The marriage between the 2 countries will be of great benefit to the country. How can I abandon the entire country because of you? Regardless of..." Zhao Man raised his head and looked at the man above the hall. He could no longer see any shadow of his former father. "When you marry the Chu state, you will become the queen of the country, and they will not treat you lightly." Huang Chen walked to her side, said something in a deep voice, and strode out of the imperial study. Wei Jian walked into the hall, paused, sighed softly, and walked out of the hall. Tang Ning waited there for a long time before she saw Zhao Man walking out in despair, swaying like a zombie whose soul had been removed. The emperor is ruthless. In the heavenly family, brother and father killings often occur, and family affection is even rarer in the human world. The marriage between Chen and Chu was related to the relationship between the 2 countries in recent years. Sacrificing the happiness of a princess marriage was not considered a choice at all from the emperor's point of view. Seeing Zhao Man walking over in a daze, Tang Ning sighed and said softly, "Princess, things are not settled yet. Maybe there will be a turn for the better, so you don't have to be too sad." Zhao Man raised her head and found that he was still standing there, feeling aggrieved as if she had found an outlet. She buried her head on his shoulder and cried, "Wow! Father really wants to marry me to the Chu kingdom. Father doesn't like me anymore, woo. I don't want to marry into Chu country, you crow's mouth, oh." Zhao Man was really sad, and her turned into woo. While crying, she hit Tang Ning's chest with her small fist. Fortunately, this place is relatively remote, the courtiers have dispersed, and no eunuchs or maids passed by, otherwise they would have thought he had done something to her. Princesses also have the helplessness of princesses. They are well dressed and well off, and are rich and noble. But when the country needs it, a piece of edict has to cross thousands of mountains and rivers, and there may be no chance to come back in this life. The area on Tang Ning's chest was wet with her tears in a short while, and he could only pat her shoulder gently. Zhao Man raised her head, looked at him with tearful eyes, and said, "You are so smart, is there any way to prevent me from getting married?" Zhao Man rarely praised him for being smart, but Tang Ning really didn't have any good solutions for this matter. Both countries are happy to facilitate this matter, and there is almost no force majeure, unless the Prince of Chu suddenly dies, Emperor Chen dies suddenly, the Emperor of Chu dies suddenly, the 2 countries go to war, Zhao Yingying becomes pregnant. Any of these things is almost impossible to happen. Looking at her expectant eyes, Tang Ning could only helplessly shake her head. Fortunate young gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 311. When she walked out of the palace, Tang Ning's shoulders were already wet, which fully proved that women are really made of water. Although Zhao Yingying was unruly and arrogant, he had a good heart and had helped Tang Ning. Of course Tang Ning would be willing to help her if possible, but there was really nothing he could do about this matter. Emperor Chen did not reject the Chu envoy on the spot, indicating that he himself was waiting for such an opportunity. Chu state's attitude was very low this time. This is rare for a big country with growing national power. Chu state has already shown enough sincerity. The next step is when Chen Guo expressed his sincerity. The marriage of a princess allowed the two countries to establish close ties in a short period of time. This account was very cost-effective for both the emperor and the courtiers. Zhao Yingying was the only one who didn't want this marriage. Her marriage has now been elevated to the level of a national policy and it is difficult to shake it any longer. The next period of time is nothing more than negotiating terms between the imperial court and the Chu state. From the first day of the Lunar New Year to the Lantern Festival, everything is closed. The emperor will not go to court, the government will not open offices, and the formal peace talks will be postponed for at least another half-month. There are other changes. Somewhere in the back hall of the palace, concubine Tang Hui looked at the tearful Zhao Man and comforted her. As a princess, you should also be responsible for these things. How can the small matters of marriage be compared with the important matters of the country? Zhao Man lowered his head and said nothing, his eyes unfocused. Concubine Tang Hui shook her head and continued, "What's more, you are marrying the Prince of Chu, and from now on you will be the Empress of the world. Isn't it much better than marrying a dandy from any family in the capital?" Zhao Man lowered his head and whispered, "Will my marriage really bring so many benefits to the court and my father?" Concubine Tang Hui nodded and said, "That's natural. The relationship between Chen and Chu has been far worse than before in recent years. If you get married, it will be recorded in the history books." After Zhao Man left in a daze, Tang Huifei sat down again, with a thoughtful look on her face. After a moment, she asked, "Does Emperor Chu still have a princess to marry?" A female officer bowed down and whispered, "I don't know." Tang Huifei looked at her and said calmly, "Check." Chongming Hall is where Emperor Chen spent his time in meditation. Emperor Chen did not return to the residence of concubine Tang Hui or concubine Fang Shu, nor did he go to any of the concubines' places to rest. He dismissed the guards on the left and right, and stood in the Chongming Hall. Only Wei Jian stood beside him. He was silent for a long time and suddenly asked, "Is what I did right or wrong?" Wei Jian was silent for a while and then said, "Your Majesty has done nothing wrong in dealing with the country and the people." Chen Huang sighed and said, "But as a father, I was wrong." Shuxiu Palace. Concubine Shu held Zhao Man's hand and sighed, "Whether it is a big family like the royal family or the capital, many things cannot be done by one's own control. Before entering the palace, I had never seen your Majesty, and now I don't feel any. What a pity." Zhao Man lowered his head, his eyes were already red and swollen, and tears kept rolling down. Concubine Shu looked at her, as if she had thought of something, and suddenly asked, "Do you have a sweetheart, Manur?" Tang Ning walked home and found that the streets of the capital were much busier than before. The first few days of the new year will be very busy. Temple fairs are held all over the capital. Many women like to go to various temples to burn incense and pray for blessings. I heard that the guanyin in a temple outside Beijing is particularly effective. My mother-in-law is very happy. I had already taken Xiaoai and Xiru to the temple to beg for a child. What she didn't know was that Tang Ning had no plans to have a child in the past 2 years. Xiaoai is only 17 years old this year, and Xiru is a little younger than him. Getting married at 17 is a little late in this era, but in a few hundred years, having 2 17-year-old wives will be like a beast. Of beasts. The best age for women to have children is between the ages of 23 and 30. The earlier or later the greater the damage to the body, so Tang Ning naturally cannot let them have children at this time, at least, or at least like Sume. When you were so old. The house was a little deserted. Xiao Ru, Xiaoai, Xiao Xiao and all the maids had gone out. Tang Ning was too lazy to cook and found 2 cold steamed buns in the kitchen to nibble on. Tang Yao Yao flew over from outside the wall, looked at him, and asked, "Is this what you want to eat?" Tang Ning asked in surprise, "Why didn't you go to the temple?" Tang Yao Yao glanced at him and said, "I'm not asking for anything. I don't want to go." Although she didn't seek a child, she could just as well seek marriage or fortune. Her fortune was Tang Ning's fortune, and Tang Ning was still waiting for her to take her with her. Tang Yao Yao looked at the steamed buns in his hand, walked to the kitchen, and came out after a while. She handed him a plate of steaming dumplings and said, "That's all we have, so just eat it." Tang Ning took the chopsticks and said, "What's wrong with this? As the saying goes, it's not as delicious as dumplings. This is already pretty good." Tang Yao Yao looked at him and asked, "Is it delicious?" "It's delicious." Tang Ning took a bite and replied without conscience, then added, "It would be better if you are jealous." Although many of the dumplings she cooked had broken skins, and those without broken skins fell apart as soon as she pinched them, Tang Ning had always known how to be satisfied. He had eaten the dumplings made by Tang Yao Yao himself, so what else could he be dissatisfied with? If rich man Tang found out, he would have to stare at him for several days. Tang Yao Yao went back to the kitchen to get some vinegar, looked at the wet marks on his shoulder, and asked, "What's wrong with your shoulder?" "I got it wet by accident." Tang Ning finally picked up a piece of dumpling skin and changed the subject. "Don't be silly and compete with Miss Su in drinking in the future. You can't beat her. Su Mei is not only older than Tang Yao Yao, but also has a drinking capacity and skills that she can't compare to. The little fairy can't beat the big fairy, even if she cheats." Tang Yao Yao curled her lips and said, "She can only drink, what else is there? Su Mei is good in many ways. In addition to being able to drink, she is beautiful, can play the flute and the piano, has good martial arts, a mysterious background, and holds a mysterious power that cannot be underestimated. Compared with Tang Yejing, she has no obvious advantage in appearance, a clear disadvantage in martial arts, a poor drinking capacity, and no talent to show off. She can't even cook dumplings well. Of course, she has long legs and is rich, so even if she has 100 shortcomings, she can cover them up." Fang Xiaoyu ran in from outside and said, "Brother Tang Ning, Sister Yao Yao, you are all at home. It's so lively outside today. Let's go out and play." There was nothing to do at home. Tang Ning finished his dumplings in a few bites and walked out of the house with them. Fang Xiaoyu took Tang Yao Yao's arm and said, "There is a temple fair outside the city today. I heard there are a lot of delicious and fun things there. Let's go too." Tang Ning didn't have any ideas. He just followed them around. The streets on the first day of the new year were indeed much more lively than usual, but the more lively one would be the Lantern Festival half a month later. Last year, during the Lantern Festival, he had just arrived in the capital. That night, he went out with Li Tianlan. Later, he met Su Mei in Tianranju and listened to her playing a song. Now, a year has passed. Li Tianlan has returned to Chu State, and Miss Su has become Sister Su. He has also visited the Hanlin Academy, the Ministry of Revenue, and the Ministry of Justice. There are all kinds of acrobatics and food at the temple fair. The line of pilgrims coming to burn incense is endless. Tang Yao Yao and Fang Xiaoyu are also in the back, and they don't know when they will get their turn. Tang Yejing had no interest in burning incense, but Fang Xiaoyu saw it as a novelty and pulled her to line up. Tang Yejing can at least pray for marriage and wealth. I don't know what a little girl like her wants. Most of the people burning incense in the temple are women. I didn't see Xiru and the others. There is more than one temple outside the capital. They should have gone somewhere else. Tang Ning walked to a remote place outside the temple and waited for them to come out. After an unknown amount of time, there was a commotion in the team ahead. Tang Ning didn't pay much attention at first, but when she heard a familiar scolding from inside, her expression froze and she walked over quickly. The team ahead had already dispersed, and several figures were lying on the ground groaning in pain. Tang Yaoyao protected Fang Xiaoyu and a strange woman behind her. A dozen men who looked like guards on the opposite side drew their weapons and confronted her from a distance, with their swords drawn. Recommended new book by Urban Master Lao Shi.